We're here to talk about democracy, your new book. Thanks for sitting down with us and answering some questions about it. It's incredibly timely right now. This notion that I see in the book is democracy is complicated, it is not easy, but it's worth it. Why would you write this book right now?
No, it absolutely is timely, but I didn't expect it to be that way. I started the book more than 3 years ago because I've always wanted to write about democracy, this kind of mysterious process by which people come to trust institutions like a constitution, courts, rule of law, really believe that when they have differences or when they have challenges, they can carry them out through institutions instead of going to the streets or instead of family or clan. And so from my point of view, it was about about this remarkable this remarkable idea of democracy and this remarkable form of government, but didn't expect to launch it quite into the atmosphere that we have now.
Well, one of the things in the current atmosphere that's been quite interesting is this notion that certain cultures can't really accept democracy, whether it's the Middle East, Russia, Syria, North Korea. I've heard a lot about, well, they're just not ready, that's just not in their psyche. You reject that in democracy. Why?
I reject it because, first of all, it's usually an argument that's made by those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democracies, right, that there's some other people that are not ready for it. But we've had this argument fall on hard times. First of all, Asians were too Confucian. But now we have great democracies in Taiwan or in Japan. The Africans were too tribal, but you have democracies in Ghana or Botswana. The Latin Americans, well, they liked caudillos, men on horseback. But of course now Brazil and Chile and Colombia are all great democracies, and you can go on and on and on. That cultural explanation after cultural explanation has just fallen apart. So I believe there are no peoples who have bad DNA when it comes to democracy, but we do have different experiences, different histories, and different challenges in trying to create democratic institutions.
One of the quotes that jumped out at me from the book was, "We still need to choose inclusion even if it collides with our desire to be race blind." You meant it in the context of a discussion about affirmative action, but right now we're having a robust discussion on criminal justice reform, on any number of different items, decreasing incarceration, addressing overcriminalization, reducing drug harm. These are all items that are in the public discourse right now. How critical are those efforts for faith in our justice system, one of the institutions that you mentioned in your book?
Yes, well, first of all, I think there are really two issues here that affect the criminal justice system and people's faith in it. Obviously, you want to punish wrongdoing.
Right.
But I think most Americans, many of whom come from a faith-based perspective, would say you also want to give people a chance. So young offenders, for instance, you'd like them to have another chance. I think that people believe that a country that is as great as America, with the numbers of people that we have incarcerated, we ought to take another look at where we are. And the interesting thing is that that is something that is crossing our partisan boundaries. You're finding people on both sides of the aisle who believe that we ought to take a look at our criminal justice system. And so I look forward to what Attorney General Sessions might do. This is something he's been interested in for a long, long time, because we also, and this is the second point, we need just not faith in our institutions, but we need faith in our ability to reform them and change them when we need to, and to do that together. Not by going to my blog or my cable news channel and just yelling at the other side, but actually working on national projects together. And I think criminal justice reform would be a great national project.
Well, it's funny that you talk about the notion of a divided nation, where we're struggling through a feeling right now where our nation is polarized. That's what we see in the news media. That's what we see on the blogs and cable news. You noted Lincoln's second inaugural phrase, "with malice towards none and charity for all." I chuckled a little bit thinking of that as a political sentiment in our modern context. How do we get there? How do we move from where we are?
Well, we've got to start talking across our differences. You know, Madison, the great really framer of our Constitution, also said there should be no permanent losers in democracy. And by that he meant know the difference between a policy dispute and a principle. When you and I disagree about policy, I might win that round. I might get the bill passed that you actually didn't support. But I need you the next time around to get the next bill passed. And so, you know, Ronald Reagan was a genius at this. He would always say, I want the other side to have dignity coming out of these challenging times. And so I think if our politicians were to behave a little bit more that way, and if we as citizens who tell our politicians, do hard things, reform entitlements, not my entitlement. And so I think citizens have to step up to this too.
So one of the things that struck me through the whole book was you spent the first 11 years of your life in Alabama during one of the worst expressions of democracy in the history of our country. Yet you point out that so many, particularly Black Americans, had faith in the American institutions. You say that it's inexplicable, but we're at a position right now where we need to renew some of that faith, where we need to renew faith that institutions, whether it's the media, whether it's the White House, whether it's the Justice Department, or even the State Department, we need to renew that belief and that faith that this is worth it, that these institutions are important. How do we sort of spread that around? How do we get people to think that?
Yeah, so one of my favorite phrases is something that comes from de Tocqueville, who came to America in 1835 from France. He just traveled around. He said, who are these Americans? The spirit of constitutionalism, the ceaseless agitation toward democracy, that every citizen has an obligation to make this democracy better. And some of the faith in institutions can come from Washington behaving better. Some of the faith in institutions comes when people see those institutions actually carry out something on their behalf. But we're very fortunate in America. We have two other pillars that we can stand on. One is federalism. Not everything has to happen in Washington. Indeed, the solutions for Alabama or California or Texas or Vermont might be very different. And so getting the federal government to try to do less and the state governments to do more because they're closer to the people, I think that will renew faith in institutions. And then the part of it that each of us individually can do is that another thing that de Tocqueville said is these Americans, they have these voluntary associations that are just to be good, to do good. He meant civil society. He meant things like the American Red Cross or the Boys and Girls Clubs. And there, it's citizen taking care of citizen, individual citizens saying there are going to be no weak links in my democracy. I'm going to make sure that that child can read. I'm going to make sure that that elder has somebody to visit him or her every day. I'm going to make sure that that teen mother has somebody to come alongside her. And so I think that we often think of strengthening our democracy just by getting it right in Washington or just getting it right in the media, but it's much broader than that. This democracy is something that all of us can be responsible for. All of us can take a role in making stronger.
Well, it's interesting that you say that something that all of us can participate in. One of the issues that's been the most controversial here recently in politics has been climate change. The Obama administration saw this as a threat to our institutions, a threat to our engagement with other countries. The Trump administration seems to take a very different tact. You see the Secretary of State acknowledging climate change and saying that it's something that we should engage, but then you see sort of questions as to how we should interact with it, what the policy changes should be from one extreme to seeming the other extreme. Where do we need to be? Is this something that should weigh in our considerations in foreign affairs as we look to spread democracy?
Well, clearly we want an environment that is clean and sustainable. Nobody wants to go back to the days when we had rivers catching on fire. Nobody wants to go back to the days when you couldn't breathe in Los Angeles. And if you look at a place like Beijing where you can't breathe, we don't want to go there. The goal, the trick, is to find a way to have the 3 E's: economic growth, environmental sustainability, and energy mix all work together. And I think the Paris Accords, the Climate Change Treaty, was trying to get that by saying every country will put together a plan. We are not going to have any goals that are set from the top. I like all of that. But I think some of the climate work forgot about the economic growth and the energy mix piece. We're going to be dependent on hydrocarbons for a long time to come. It's not going to be replaced by wind. It's not going to be replaced by solar. Natural gas, now there's a winner because it's both environmentally sound and it's plentiful in America and in North America. The piece that I'm looking to and asking our leaders to do is to make sure that they take full advantage of from North America all the way down, from Canada all the way down to Mexico, this great North American energy platform that could make us not just less dependent on others, but it could change the geopolitics of oil and gas. I will tell you, I was the Secretary of State when the price of oil went to $147 a barrel. It empowered Vladimir Putin to cut off energy supply to Ukraine. It empowered Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to try to buy elections all over Latin America. It empowered the Iranians to use their oil wealth to keep from dealing with the world on their nuclear program. So there are a lot of benefits to getting this right, but I like to think of the policy as having all three elements. Economic growth, because we need it and everybody needs it. Environmental sustainability, because we need it and everybody wants it. And energy mix, because that's what's going to get us there.
Well, in terms of energy, technology is changing the game plan a lot. At the end of your book, you noted that technology has been far more successful at tearing down institutions than building up new ones. What would your advice be to leaders in the technology sector saying this is the Wild West of innovation, of economic growth? How can they support the institutions critical to democracy?
That's such a good point. I live in Silicon Valley. I live right in the heart of a place where everybody thinks technology is always good. And I say to people, technology is neutral. It's how it's used. It's how it interacts with institutions that matters. And Americans and people worldwide haven't always been as wise as we have been knowledgeable. And so when you're thinking about a technology, for instance, that could change education, think about the fact that that technology, online learning, might make it possible for people in very rural areas to have access to really high quality education. But it could also, if used badly, make kids in schools that are already well off way ahead of kids who are going to poor neighborhood schools. So just, I would say to the leaders in the technology community, yes, by all means, keep innovating, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible, but always remember that that technology has to be understood and used in a context. And you, the leaders in the technology sector, have to be a part of that conversation.
So I want to turn and get a little bit more personal. In 2003, I was at the National Prayer Breakfast, and I listened to you talk about God playing in the key of C and how you returned to your faith. It was interesting for me because that was a period of my life where I'd lost my brother 2 years earlier. I was wondering, the world was upside down. And one of the quotes from that is, "We're living through a time of testing and consequence and praying that our wisdom and will are equal to the work before us. And it is times like these that we are reminded of a paradox, that it's a privilege to struggle." And that hit me personally, that I was personally struggling. And you were talking about terrorism and some of our national challenges. But it was interesting hearing from a civic leader about the role that her faith had played in her career and her decisions. In writing this book, what's the role of faith in the spread of democracy?
Well, faith is both intensely personal, and it can give a community a joint way to think about doing good. It's no surprise, it's no accident that a lot of our best civil society institutions are faith-based. Because for people who believe that there's a higher power, every life's worthy. And so you can't leave somebody on the side of the street, or you can't leave that orphan there. You're called to want to do that. I don't say that people who don't believe aren't called to do good things. They are, but it comes from a different place for people of faith. It comes from the belief that we're all children of a God, and therefore no one should be left on the side. I think in forming a type of government, the most important thing is to allow faith to be a matter of conscience, to be a matter of individual choice, not to try to impose it. The founding fathers were brilliant, our American founding fathers, in this. Again, Madison said that when the state adopts a religion, it erodes both the state and the religion, because it's not a matter of choice for human beings. They have to come to that faith through prayer and through connection with God, not through the state saying it. And so we have a system that protects our right to worship as we please and to worship not at all, if we wish. And as I would go around the world, that was a very powerful message for people all over the world. And one of the problems we're having in the Middle East is that religion and politics are mixed in ways that are sometimes problematic and sometimes just downright dangerous. And so Islam has been most peaceful in societies where there is room for religious difference and religious tolerance. The United States, India, Indonesia. And so getting that right is the key, because our framers gave us such a great way to worship God, but not to go to the streets to decide that we need to show that God is on our side and no one else's.
Two more questions. One of the messy debates that we're going through right now is dealing with a lot of Confederate monuments. That's happening around the country. It's here in Alabama, Louisiana, elsewhere. How do we resolve something like that where some people are saying, well, this is our heritage, let's retain it. For others, that's a deeply hurtful monument. Yeah. How should we engage that process?
Well, my view is that it's actually not our heritage, it's our history. We as a people have thankfully moved on. We as a people have, in very painful ways. I mean, I'm not that old, and I lived in a Birmingham that was still segregated. And so it is painful. But if you forget your history, then you are likely to repeat it. And one of the things about statues and monuments and the like is that for those who weren't a part of that history, it can be a reminder. I have students who were not born when the Soviet Union collapsed. And they're maybe not going to remember that in the way that I did, that there was once this thing called the Soviet Union. Nobody is alive today who remembers the Civil War. But by looking at that, you can trigger what it meant and what it was like. You don't have to honor the purposes of people whose history now shows that they were on the other side of history, but you'd better be able to remind people. And so I myself am not much for whitewashing history. I don't like the renamings. I don't like the taking down the various monuments. You know, I know that, for instance, the flag, Confederate flag, I agreed completely with Nikki Haley and others who removed, that was a battle flag of the defeated Confederacy. That's a different matter. But these historical figures, we need to remember who they are, what they stood for, and why we've moved on.
Well, I'm now getting to the point as an Alabama fan that I can talk about it. I've made it through my period of mourning, but one of the things that's probably very important to many of the folks here in Alabama is you were a member of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. Yes. You've rolled off that. Yes. What do we need to know? What's the inside baseball? I mean, tell us about your time. Did you enjoy it?
I loved being a member of the College Football Playoff Committee. It's the best committee I've ever been on, and I've been on a lot of committees. But what was so great about this committee was everybody was so dedicated. People, I watched 12, 14 games on a weekend. And then I'd do the coach's cut, you know, the tape, and then I'd fly to Dallas Monday, Tuesday, we'd deliberate. Nobody came into that room with an agenda. Everybody came into that room trying to make the best choice possible. Just so everybody knows, I was recused on Stanford, because I teach at Stanford. But nobody really had a team. Everybody was trying to do the best thing possible. Wonderful representatives, great football people. I said, you know, my dad was a football coach when I was born, and I was supposed to be his All-American linebacker. And I suspect he thought he's gone to the Lord, but I suspect he thought I'd finally gotten a really important job. You know, I was picking football teams. And oh, by the way, what a great championship game. Alabama and Clemson twice gave us two of the great championship games in history. And I just look forward to the next year, but I'll get my weekends back.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yes, ma'am.